Putting on this computer. Okay. The last couple of weeks, I think the first week we generally dealt with the overall aspects of what is it, in what context coaching is spiritual, probably a little bit of my own experiences, various states of awareness and stuff like that. And I think in the last session, we went into a much deeper discussion on the use of self. And there were some of you who participated in it as well. I mean, just to recap, the use of self is, of course, it's a very well-known Eastern concept and probably a reasonably powerful Jungian concept as well. But it's been used far more often in recent times in Gestalt and organizational development to some extent. Most of the OD work that is done by NTL and others features use of self in some way. And essentially, it's about our interactions with other people and with a larger environment, which could be the institution that we are part of, the family that we are part of, the company that we are part of. So it combines, I guess, at least three elements. One is the intrapersonal, which is about investigation ourselves, which Daniel Goleman and others describe so well as emotional intelligence, how we become aware of what our emotions are. And eventually, with awareness, we are able to control our emotions rather than the emotions controlling us. That's the intrapersonal part of it. The second is how we apply that intrapersonal awareness and the management to people around us with whom we interact, which could be the individuals with whom we interact, or the groups that whom we interact with, or the larger system with which we interact. And so it becomes interpersonal in terms of interacting with other people, individually or in groups. And it could be, in a much larger sense, a collective interaction, a systemic interaction, which could either be with a smaller group of people, family, tribe, company, organization, or a much larger entity, such as probably the society at large, the environment at large, the earth, for example, or the universe, depending upon how you want to go. And so there is a third element which comes into play in this. And I wish we had Fiona in here today in this particular call. It's about the transpersonal, the interpersonal, intrapersonal, the intrapersonal, interpersonal, and then the transpersonal. The transpersonal, if you really look at a defined dictionary meaning, it's about going beyond the self. It's beyond the mind and the body into a larger space. And that space could be what is generally being referred to as spiritual, with no religious connotations. It's just that it is beyond us in a sense. So then it brings us back into this whole question of what is awareness? Awareness as defined by perhaps ICF in the coaching context. What does it have to do with another competency called presence? And how does awareness lead into something more applied, which is in terms of action? So I just want to stop here for a moment. And if you have, any of you have any questions on not just what I have talked about now, but in terms of what we talked about last week in the use of self, if there are any specific questions, because I would like to take you into a bit of a journey into different aspects of this definition of awareness and consciousness, which by sheer dictionary meaning either may not mean anything at all to anybody or may mean everything to everybody in whichever way they want to sort of interpret that. Yeah, Kannan, can you explain a little more on transpersonal? I really wish I could. But the trouble is that transpersonal is, in my personal experience, is extremely experiential. At the very simplest level, what I would request you to do are two things. One is refer to people who are really phenomenally powerful in this field. Fiona Campbell, for example, her website has some elements of it in it. There are elements of it in Alan Seal, who does a fair amount of work in this space, though he doesn't call it transpersonal, he calls it by some other name. And some of you who are part of Kucharia from the older days would know Leon van der Poel, who used to be my mentor and teacher at the International Coach Academy. And he does a lot of work on what he calls a deep awareness creation, which I would equate to transpersonal. So it's going beyond, let's say, thoughts and emotions. It's going beyond what Daniel Goleman would call as the emotional intelligence, which then brings us into trying to define what is the difference between thoughts, emotions, and feelings, or the chicken and story, which is somebody is asking, has the session started? Reena Desai, yes, the answer is the session has started. So I hope that others can view and hear me. If there is a problem, please do let me know, because there have been some questions which are here. So in a layman's word, let's talk about it a little bit more. Karan, thanks for asking this question. It's I think most people understand the difference between thoughts and emotions. Even if you're not able to fully explain it, I'm not sure what the dictionary meanings are, but thoughts are cognitive, emotions are something which is more felt. So what does this mean then? What is felt? Feel is one of the senses. Feel is a sense which is about touch of the five senses: the seeing, the hearing, the smelling, tasting, and then the touching. And in fact, in NLP and some of those disciplines, Gestalt and so on, the kinesthetic part of it, the feeling part of it, is considered to be as important as the visual and auditory part in terms of how you exhibit that sense. How do you go deep into your emotions and you're able to feel it? So the question is there a difference between feeling and emotions? To me, the difference is very, very simply put, and I may be completely wrong. Each one of you may have a different opinion. Some of you have a much, much better explanation than I can possibly give. And I'd be quite happy for you to put it up into the chat box or come up on the panel. I think, in my experience, feeling is a sensation, it's a verb, and emotion is a noun. That's the simplest way that I would like to describe that. When I try to convert that, what I sense, into something more cognitive, I see it as an emotion. So, for example, I feel fear, I feel desire, I feel anxiety, etc. And when I try to label them, they become the emotions. And along with the labels, there is a certain amount of cognition that comes in. And when we go into an area like coaching, my personal feeling again is that it is much better that you deal with these at the basic, elemental, most authentic, the rawest level of creation. So it's far, far more effective for us to deal with ourselves as well as our clients at the feeling level. So in a sense, therefore, the feeling level is about the somatic experience. If you feel anxiety, where do you feel anxiety? Yeah, emotions are linked to moods. Feelings are linked to moods. What are moods? God alone knows. Are moods sparked by your thoughts, or sparks thought create this thing? There's a chicken and egg story. You can go on and on. So I don't want to get into any cognitive discussion on this. But if you really want to understand what the difference between feelings and emotions, I would only simply like you to look at it this way. Try and see, if you can, the feeling as a verb, something that you are actually experiencing, that you are doing, and you are perhaps being, in a sense, as well. And emotion is more a verbal veneer in terms of a label that you give to it, which in turn could lead into cognitive definitions of what you're trying to do. And generally, and I'm sure many of us we have discussed it at the MCC level and others, when you get into a cognitive discussion mode with a client or anybody for that matter, it never stays at a very authentic level, because cognition, the thought, can often lie, whereas emotions and feelings normally do not. It's very, very difficult to fake an emotion. Yes, of course, if you're a very good actor, you can. We can get into a huge argument on that. But on an average, if you are a reasonably good listener, if you have reasonably good awareness, you would be able to distinguish between someone who's faking an emotion, whereas it would be extremely difficult to determine whether someone is faking a thought. So I'll leave it here for a moment, and then could you explain the competency 4.6, inviting to, yeah, I accept the client's response. Yeah, I'll explain that. We are not there yet at this point in time. It is one of the most important competencies that we need to decide that we need to display in a coaching conversation, especially at the mastery level. Perhaps not that important at the PCC level. Two elements to it. One is in terms of understanding what the client is contributing, which is about very powerful active listening. And the second is going into ourselves and experiencing what is then happening within us as emotions, feelings, or thoughts, or whatever that is coming up, and which is in support of the client, which is the most important part, which is able to look at it in what Otto Scharmer calls a generative listening mode, that we are able to see the client in the space the client wishes to be, and we are congruent with the needs of the client. And at that space, then you convey it back to the client and invite the client to progress further. And then irrespective of what the client comes up with, whether the client agrees with you, disagrees with you, that's perfectly okay. You have done your job by sharing, by inviting the client to contribute. So there are multiple elements here. The first element is the active listening. The second element is the active generative listening, to be able to see the client in an upward spiral, moving into the potential that the client wants to reach. And then look inwards, the third level, into ourselves as coaches to see what is it that is bringing up for us. And at the fourth level, how do we share that appropriately with the client and allow the client to move, progress further. And finally, to allow the client to express himself or herself in whichever way the client wants to, so that it is in support of the client, in partnership of the client, and move it forward. I mean, I've just mentioned about 5 levels. There could be many more. It's you need to really combine the 4.6, not only just the 4.6, the entire presence competency 4, with competency 5, which is active listening, and with awareness, competency 8. And if you see them together, you would see something extremely powerful emerging. And that's not the purpose of this call, unfortunately. I'm not going into details about how to interpret PCCs. Though Madhu, you've asked a very, very important question. I would suggest that you raise these questions in the learner webinars. Please join us on the 4th Wednesdays, where Cindy and I both will be talking about competencies in more detail. So today, I would like to go back, if you don't mind, with this whole aspect of awareness and consciousness. And again, the same way as we have problems in defining thoughts, emotions, feelings, and so on, awareness and consciousness are, I mean, it's everybody's interpretation as what you want. And if you go to the dictionary, different dictionaries define it in different ways. I'll again go back into something very, very fundamental. If you look at the human evolution, and if you look at the evolution of species, in a sense, the Darwinian sense, and if you go up to the mammalian kind of evolution up to that point, even including the primates, essentially, what they all do at that level, I wouldn't like to call them animals, because I have far greater respect for animals than I have sometimes for human beings. They are reactive, and they are not necessarily in a responding mode. The difference is this. Most animals, most of the times, they behave in a very instinctive manner. They are driven by certain natural codes. And therefore, if, for example, if you were to disturb even your pet dog, unless the dog has been disciplined so horribly that it has lost all its natural instincts, and if you're trying to take away a piece of bone that the dog is gnawing at, it's very likely the dog will turn around and bite you, how much you are close to the dog, or a cat will scratch your eyes, or whatever. So the instinct of an animal is when it is disturbed from something that it is extremely attached to, desirous of, is to fight for that. And in a human being, there is a stage in between. You have the ability to think and reflect and to be able to decide whether that reactive mode is the most appropriate mode. And I think personally that that's one of the most important criteria that differentiates humans from animals, in the sense of from pure instinct into something which is probably more appropriate called intelligence. And there's a third level, which is called intuition, which is a much higher level, which I think probably 90% of humans don't have either. Now, when we talk about this movement from reactive to the responsive mode, what it entails are a couple of things. One is, at the instinctive level, essentially there are two emotions at play: desire and fear. That which attracts us and that which repulses us. And this in turn leads to what may be called, and I'm sort of making it as psychology for dummies, and this is not quite the right way to explain it. However, it is a fight or flight reaction. You fight for it if you are so desirous of it and you believe that the other person who is in some sense competing with you is someone who can be overcome. And therefore you fight and try and make sure that you get what you want. Or if the opponent is much bigger than you, then you run away from there, and that is a flight. So that's a very, very simplistic way of putting it. And in fact, unfortunately, there are some coaching techniques which still follow the pure fear and desire model as far as coaching is concerned, which I think is a bit of a pity, because there are multiple other mix of emotions which come up and feelings which come up in the human interactions. And if you want to know more about how this works, there are several sources. The whole behavioral psychology of B.F. Skinner, for example, from Pavlovian to Skinner, that conditioning a dog to sort of listen to the ringing of a bell while it is being offered food, and therefore at any time you ring the bell, even if there is no food, the dog salivates. So the same way that you can train people, and Skinner was one of the early exponents of that. And in latest days, in more recent times, this has been taken into much higher levels. You can read Bruce Lipton, Biology of Beliefs, where he talks about at length what is called the HPA axis, that how these emotions, how we sense what is happening around us, the fear or the desire, that activates a part of our brain called the hypothalamus, which in turn activates the master gland called pituitary, which in turn activates the adrenaline, the HPA axis. And adrenaline releases a chemical adrenaline, which usually powers the extremities, either the feet or the hands. So if you are in a fighting mode, you use your hands. If you're in a fleeing mode, you use your legs. And there's a lot of experimental work that Lipton and others have done on this. You could read on this. And it's not purely a neural phenomenon. It's also a cellular phenomenon. And if you read Molecules of Emotion by Candace Pert, she talks about how in the cellular system, each cell has intelligence to carry this without even the need for the nerves and so on. So there's a tremendous amount of material which is available on this. And where, in a sense, biology, neurology, psychology, and spirituality probably all come into one space to give you a better understanding of what you can create as awareness about what you feel. And unlike in an animal, instead of reacting instinctively to it as nature dictates, as it were, out of fear or desire, you can also take a decision as to do something else. And that is exactly what we practice in coaching at the highest level. And therefore, the minimal awareness of just being aware of what we are thinking about, feeling about, is not good enough in coaching. We need to go into a much higher level. And that is really where I would like to take you to a little bit today in terms of what I would like to term as the 4 states of awareness. At this point in time, if there are any questions, I really would like you to ask me, and we can cover that. We are somewhere about 1/3 way. And if any of you would like to come on the panel and awareness of awareness is consciousness, I have no idea. Whether awareness itself is consciousness, whether awareness of awareness is consciousness, I don't know. These are words. I would think of awareness and consciousness pretty much very, very similar. These are different words used. Maybe awareness is more physical. We can talk about physical awareness, bodily awareness, mental awareness. Whereas when we talk about consciousness, we talk about probably something which is, at the very least, it's mental and going beyond the individual mind and body into something larger space. And therefore, you are talking about super consciousness and so on. So I honestly, I do not know. And we can explore that, but I'm not sure whether that's going to lead into anything very important. That's my personal feeling. Yeah. Any other questions on whatever we have talked about now in terms of feelings, emotions, thoughts, and this whole aspect of how it leads into something called awareness, which we might be able to use in coaching. If you have any questions, I'll answer that. Otherwise, or if any of you would like to come on the panel and ask any questions, share your views. Can question be typed to all panelists attending so we can understand the question? Yeah, please. Yeah, put them to everybody. So here there are a couple of points that I noted down, and whatever I started talking to you about was probably sparked by a couple of questions that people asked. And I think it is extremely important to understand what is the difference between what we call as feelings and emotions and then thoughts. And coming back to this particular question that Sunil had asked, in terms of awareness, let me put it this way. There's these concepts of metacognition, for example. The humans are considered to be the only people or the only species which is able to think about thinking. So in a sense, what you're talking about, awareness of awareness, could be that. I'm not quite sure. Certainly, we are probably the only species because of the way our brains have developed into the prefrontal cortex and so on. We are able to think about our emotions, for instance. We are able to think about our thinking, and we are able to figure out, reflect, self-reflection. And self-reflection, in turn, is one of the foundational requirements of coaching. Without the self-reflection of a coach, there can be absolutely no awareness creation in the client. So all these things add up. At what stage would you allow in intuition to take over? All times, to be honest. But it's really, I'll come to that. That is where we will cover that intuitive part. Just hold that, Suhas. And if it's not clear, please do ask me at that point in time. Okay, and I'm glad about some of your responses, Mohan, Gopal, and others. This is something, in a sense, very meta. It's trance, in a sense. It goes beyond the conventional way that we look at it. I think pretty much any of us can really sit down and talk to each other about the 11 competencies of ICF and 8 competencies of EMCC and the sub-competencies, which are 80 or 90. And we can offer our own interpretations. One of the things that we keep going deeper and deeper at the MCC level when we do the mastery classes is to question as to why those competencies are in place, why those sub-competencies are in place. Like Madhu asked earlier about the 4.6, what is the purpose of that marker? What does it make you do as a coach? I think it's much more important to understand that. Something as simple as, for example, when we start with marker 2.1, which is about a clear definition, unambiguous definition of the desired outcome of the client. I don't remember the exact wording. And I remember we had probably 2 sessions of discussion on that alone. Why is it important? And it's important to understand why it is important, because all coaching depends just on that. Coaching is not a coffee table conversation. It's not a time pass effort. It's about a specific a desire that someone has and which that person is, for some reason, blocked into achieving and needs therefore help. And invariably, that block is external. That block is not internal. That block is internal, not external. And if it's external barrier, the person can't get any kind of support and overcome that. It's internal barrier, very often unconscious barrier. That's where the problem is. And so it's very, very important to start with something. And the question is often asked, and many people sort of propound on that for hours together, that what's the point in asking, because that's never the end point. That's the whole point. So you start somewhere. And at least then it's like, if you see a kitten playing around with a ball of thread and you sort of unravel the whole thread and finally come to a point, you are really looking for that ultimate source, which may be nothing really. And what is it that is really coming up? Is it in alignment with the original outcome that a person described? Or is it something completely different? John Whitmore, in a very famous interview, once said that every coaching session, in thousands of what I have done, everybody starts always with some material transactional outcomes. And as I go deeper, it completely changes. It's about something to do with service. It's something to do with spiritual. And that's exactly what I have found. Even if they are executives, and very often coaches come to me and say, oh, it's very transactional. It never is transactional. It always starts as transactional. And it's up to you as a coach to convert the transaction into a transformation, because the transaction is often blocked by something internal. And that internal is very often an emotional block. And awareness of that emotional block is the key to be able to succeed in coaching, to be able to help the client. So just going back into that intuition. Okay, so I would like to sort of give you a very basic overview of how what you might call as a conscious mind or the aware mind is being looked at by various people. And I often like to say, it sounds like a smart thing to do, that Freud is the first person who made the unconscious conscious, in the Western world at least. In the Eastern world, this has been available for probably 5,000 years or more. The Upanishads, the scriptures, and there is one called the Mandukya Upanishad, which is just 12 verses, which talks about the 4 states of awareness. And that was probably 5,000 years before Freud, till the Western world discovered what the meaning of consciousness was. And Freud described it in 3 stages: conscious mind, unconscious mind, and the subconscious mind. And he talked about the id, ego, and the superego, all that. I don't want to go into too much details in that. And at the Freudian level, the unconscious mind was a cesspool. It was a cesspool of all the negatives. It was about traumas, it's about sex, it's about violence, it's about guilt, it's about everything that is not good. When it came to Jung, who was a contemporary and who separated from Freud at a point in time, or even a disciple initially, he said the unconscious is not always bad. He said the unconscious sometimes can be the most powerful support system for an individual. And he labeled unconscious into 2 parts: the individual unconscious and the collective unconscious. And if you go deeper into it, my purpose is not to go deeper into Jung at this point in time. And I'm a great fan of Jung and have read a lot about what he has read. But he's written the collective unconsciousness in terms of symbols, archetypes, and so on and so forth. the individuals in terms of shadows and lights and so on and so forth. There's a tremendous amount to be learned from the Jungian interpretation and also from the Freudian interpretation. And when we take that in alignment or in sort of relationship with the Eastern philosophy of Hinduism and Buddhism, which evolved from Hinduism in many ways, it's the collective unconscious is in some ways, in many ways, is very similar to what we call the collective conscious in the Hindu-Buddhist philosophy. In Buddhist philosophy, it's called the Akashic record philosophy, and in the Hindu philosophy, it is called the Brahman or the Atman. But in a very, very simply put, I would like to go the three stages that Jung and Freud describe as conscious, subconscious, and unconscious. There is a fourth stage which is described in the Mandukya Upanishad, which was dealt with in much greater detail later with Zen Buddhism, and that becomes a fourth state of awareness. And that is really what I would like to go into a little more detail today, and we can take that up. It may not finish today. It can be expanded in the next classes as well. Okay, let me just, how do we use cognition and awareness together? We'll come to that. You can, if you really get into that state, it's an experiential state, you find that awareness is both cognitive, non-cognitive, transcognitive, and emotive. And these are just words that I'm using. The first state of awareness is possibly what is called the conscious state of awareness by Freud and Jung. In that state of awareness, which is often called mindfulness today, you are aware of your own identity, you are aware of what you think you're doing. So these are the two cornerstones. So in mindfulness, it's all about you're being fully aware of what your sensory perceptions are, what your emotions which are coming up for you are, which is absolutely essential. Very often people think that I am against mindfulness. It's not true. I think mindfulness is a starting point of awareness. You need to have it. Like Vivekananda famously said, you need to have some religion to start your life with, but it's not religion that you can die with. The same way, it is necessary for you to start with mindfulness, but you need to grow out of it into something more serious, more deeper awareness as you progress by. What I mean by that is that when you are mindful, or when you are in the first state of awareness, I would like to call it version 1.0 of awareness, it is about your being aware of, in a sense, what is happening with you in terms of perhaps thoughts, in terms of emotions, in terms of bodily feelings, and so on and so forth. So you are very focused on what those senses are telling you. And this very often, while you are still aware, it leads you into being controlled by your senses as well. And those of you who are familiar with yoga, you would know that the yoga has 8 limbs. It's called Ashtanga Yoga. Out of that, the first 4 parts are called the external yoga or the Bahiranga Yoga. And these are about the codes of conduct, universal codes of conduct called yamas, the internal codes of conduct called niyamas, the bodily postures called the asanas, and the breathing practice called the pranayama. These are preparatory stages, just like the way the mindfulness is. And mindfulness is very much part of this external yoga, the first 4 parts of yoga, where you are fully aware of how you sit, how you breathe, and how you think, and how you emote, and all that awareness. It's all very, very important. But there's a point at which you have to break away from it and move upwards, as it were. The next 4 stages of yoga, which are called the Antaranga Yogas, which starts with the first one, which is moving away from the senses, called Pratyahara. And the second one is called, Pratyahara, Dharana, Dhyana, and Samadhi are the 4, the next stages. Dharana is about, as you move away from the senses, out of the control of the senses, then you train yourself to focus at one sense at a time to sharpen your supersensory ability. And from there, you move away from the senses altogether into a state where you are just looking at the movement of the minds, as it were, in a cognitive, emotional sense, that's called dhyana. And finally, you move into the samadhi, which is beyond all that. Without going too deep into this, and those of you who want to know more about it, we can have a separate conversation, or even in next sessions, I can go into details on this. The first state of awareness of the 4 states of awareness as described by Mandukya Upanishad, which is called the awake, the Jagrat state, is what we today in Western world call the mindfulness state. And one of the problems I have with the word mindfulness is because it was an interpretation of a Buddhist word called sati by Buddha in a very incorrect way by whoever was the English scholar translator into this word called mindfulness. Because sati means memory in Sanskrit and Pali. And it's not a very good word, because memory is just like the way that Freud and Jung also described it. Memory is not considered to be something very good in the philosophical sense. It's a conditioned memory. Memory corrupts us in many ways. And this leads to conditioning, and many of our behavioral problems arise from the memory. And therefore, the word that Buddha used as sati was in reference to correcting the memory into the right memory. And the memory itself was taken as the word for mindfulness. And today, focusing on what creates that memory in terms of senses, that becomes a cornerstone of mindfulness. So there's a bit of a conflict out there. And therefore, I would like to keep that as a starting point of awareness, as a version 1.0, where we are fully aware of what we are doing, or we believe we are aware of what we are doing. And this is the state that is called the Jagrat, or the awake state in Sanskrit, in the Mandukya Upanishad. The reason why it is called the awake state is that at least now you are awake to the possibilities of what is happening around you, instead of being dead, being completely unaware. So it's the first state of awareness as opposed to a state of complete unawareness. The second state of awareness is one in which there is an element of separation between the physical and the non-physical identity. That is called the dream state in Sanskrit. It is called the sapna state, which is somewhat akin to the subconscious state. For example, in a dream state, all experiences that we have, whether we have a nightmare or a positive dream, are very, very real. They are just as good as they are happening in real life. Except that, let's say if a lion attacks you, or an animal or a person attacks you, you wake up in a nightmare with a deep emotional trauma, but you had to have no physical evidence of that trauma ever having been inflicted upon you. So it happens at a plane which in the Upanishads we call as there are different skins, as we call it, sariras, different bodies at which we experience this. It's at a second or the third level of the body, where it is at the pranic sarira, or the breath awareness sarira, and that is a subconscious state. This subconscious state is very powerful for very many reasons. It could be a very good catharsis point. It could also be a good awareness point if you are able to remember what happened during that period and try to analyze. It could be potentially something which predicts something that may happen. It may be something which is about a conditioned experience which is manifesting itself within us, and therefore it might lead to some behavioral clues. So an awareness of this state, the second level of awareness called the sapna awareness, is something which can benefit us a lot if we can remember what happens. In neurobiological sense, this is the rapid eye movement state of the body, at which point we are not fully asleep, we are not fully awake, we are moving, flitting between wakefulness and deep sleep, and that is the in-between state. And the third state, is what is called Shushupti, or it is called the deep sleep state, at which point there is no thought process that is happening. But at the same time, the body is not completely unconscious, though it is called the unconscious state. There are certain regenerative functions which are happening. Autonomous nervous system is fully active. And in Sanskrit, this particular state is, ironically, it is also called as prajna, which is a word for awareness. It took me a very, very long time to try and understand experientially as to what that meant. Because there is a deep, deep awareness that is created at this stage. But it is still the third state of awareness, which is not the final state of awareness. In fact, those of you who are familiar with the Transcendental Meditation, and if you have ever read Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's original book on Transcendental Meditation, this is a state that he describes as a starting point of how TM works, where bubbles of thought arise at the bottommost point of one's mind into tiny, sort of minute bubbles. And as they move up, they become bigger and bigger, and they burst out into full-fledged thoughts and emotions. And the way that in Transcendental Meditation this is used to go down to that level and to be able to, in a sense, capture those seeds of thoughts that they arise as, and to even, if possible, reframe that. So you can technically, once you are fully capable of this process, get into that state and be able to reframe yourself extremely powerfully. You can recreate yourself. And this is, in fact, one of the processes that I use in what I would like to teach in future, and I have taught in the past, as creating your future. This is called the third state of awareness. The first state of awareness is the Jagrat, or the awake state. The second is the dream or the sapna state, as somebody put it here, the sukshma sarira or the prana sharira or the swapna, which is a dream, the subconscious equivalent. And the third is the deep sleep, supposedly the unconscious, not fully unconscious, which is called the Sushupti in Sanskrit, but also called the Prajna state. And the final state, the fourth state, is a state of awareness that I talked about as the ultimate in awareness, which in yoga is called Samadhi. And at which state the difference is that you are not unconscious, you're fully conscious. You are aware of everything that happens around you, your thoughts, your emotions, others' thoughts, their emotions. But at the same time, you are not an active player in that field. You are merely a witness. You are just an observer. You observe the thoughts as they arise, as if they are like clouds in the sky, moving around, and you do not feel attached to it in any way. And those of you who are somewhat familiar with the Bhagavad Gita and the verses, there is this very famous verse in the third chapter of Gita, which says, Karmanya vadikarastu ma paleshu kadachita, that don't be attached to the outcome. Work towards the outcome. Do what you have to do, but surrender the outcome to me. And that's what Krishna tells Arjuna. That an extraordinarily powerful meaning. And today, that is a concept that is used in concepts like the Six Sigma, in process control and stuff like that, where the only way that you can really achieve the highest level of performance is by not getting obsessed with what you want to achieve. It sounds like a conundrum, it sounds like an idiotic statement, but that has been proven time and out again. And I can go, I am an expert in that field, so I'm quite happy to discuss it in detail with anybody. The whole Six Sigma concept is based on this very simple Gita principle, which is don't be obsessed with outcome, just focus on the journey. And that is really what a coach should do. I find again and again this one simple fact which is muddying up a coach's performance. Because the coach believes that the most important thing to do is to first find out what the client wants to achieve, even if by force making the client believe that this is what the client wants to achieve, and then work towards it by completely taking the monkey on your back. And that doesn't help coaching in any way. It just makes you another mentor. It makes you perhaps a consultant, but it doesn't make you a coach, even at the ACC level. Forget about PCC and mastery. So the fourth state of awareness, I think, is the first level that every coach has to reach. That forget about the outcome, just believe in the process. In fact, if you go through the ICF competencies and the mastery, one of the things that comes up there is that you reach the mastery level when the coach is confident about oneself, about the client, and about the process. These three things have to happen. And when you want to practice at that level, the one thing that needs to happen is where you disengage from what is happening around you. At the same time, being completely aware of what is happening around you. It may seem like a contradiction. It is not. And it can happen. In order for that to happen, you have to have confidence. You have to have the belief that I can be in that state of awareness where I can watch what is going on, but at the same time, I'm not attached what I watch as what is going on around me. That is what needs to happen. So somebody asked about, I think Suhas asked earlier about intuition. In a sense, it's not exactly the same, but this is also the state of intuition, because what happens is at that state, when you are able to disengage yourself, you are able to get into expanding the time-space boundary that you operate in. And this is very esoteric, it's exotic, it's also somewhat dangerous. You are able to perceive what might potentially happen. And you are taking the generative listening to the next higher level. And I'm speaking from experience. This is something that can be done. You can learn how to do that. But you have to use it very carefully. That's another aspect of it. Because intuition, truly what it means is, if the verb intuit is about knowing something about something that has not yet happened, but it is likely to happen. So at a purely guesswork level, yeah, it is a probability of 50-50, but you can increase it to maybe a 60 or 70, at which level it can still be extremely powerful, where you have some prefrontal cortex ideation, understanding of what might happen as a result of what you observe, but at the same time, the ability to disengage with what is happening around you. So I think I have made it sufficiently complicated at this stage. So I'll stop here for a minute and look at what you have put down there, or if any of you would like to ask further. These are the 4 states of awareness, as simply as can be explained. For those of you who want to know more, please do go to the Mandukya Upanishad. There are some extraordinarily powerful commentaries which have been written about this. There is the original, the best is Shankara. The only major Upanishad that he didn't comment upon was the Mandukya. His guru Govindapada had commented on it. That commentary is available. Chinmayananda's commentary is available. There are other people, Ramakrishna Ashram commentaries, I believe, are the best. So you can read those, the 12 verses, you can try and do that. So yeah, I'll stop here. The book I just mentioned, I don't know what book I mentioned. I mentioned many books. One was, what do you call it, Molecules of Emotion by Candace Pert, C-A-N-D-A-C-E-P-E-R-T. Molecules of Emotion, Google that, you will find it. Bruce Lipton is a neurobiologist, a very, very reputed neurobiologist. His book is called Biology of Beliefs. And the Hindu scripture that I mentioned is called the Mandukya, M-A-N-D-U-K-Y-A, Mandukya Upanishad. And you can get a commentary from many people. The same concept of the 4th state of awareness is called no mind in Zen. There's a person called D.T. Suzuki who has written 3 volumes, enormously difficult volumes to read. But in one of those volumes, I think it's volume 2, he devotes a whole chapter to what is called no mind. And Kanan, you asked, would you be able to share what is the being state? That is exactly the being state. The no mind state, where your mind, and with relevance to that, the body, do not influence anything that you are experiencing at that point in time. You are completely separated from it. You are non-judgmental. You are not connected to the ego state, is what really is a being state. The being state doesn't mean that you are not doing that. This is the biggest mistake that people make. The ability to be in the being state and be able to be active, that is a quintessence of being in the being state. And that is really the whole concept of what is called Ardhanarishwara in the Hindu concept of the man and woman coming together, Shiva and Shakti coming together. The Shiva is the ultimate in the being state. Shakti is the ultimate in the active state. But they coexist. And the coexistence happens at a level where it's a non-judgmental, active being state, as it were. It may be very difficult to verbally understand what it is. But you can get into the being state completely oblivious to any obsession about what I want to achieve and totally be in the present moment. And at the same time, be able to achieve results which are amazingly powerful. And that can be the being state. The being state does not mean it's a passive state. The being state can be an extremely active state. Focus on the journey and the destination. Yes, there are many other greater people who have said that. Buddha has said that beautifully. The Upanishads say that all the time. Can you be detached and non-reactive be misinterpreted? Yes, it can be. You're absolutely right. Can being detached. So it is really about, that is where in coaching, the competencies of 2, 3, and 4 come in. And if you are able to establish with the client something that the client wants to move towards, and you are able to establish that space of trust and intimacy with the client and establish that partnership as presence, very unlikely the client is going to misinterpret. The misinterpretation happens when the coach does not express properly what is happening within the coach himself or herself. And somehow the ICF competencies are misinterpreted. They don't mean that anyway. That you do not, I mean, there's nothing which says there the coach cannot share. In fact, again and again in partnership and awareness, it's about the coach is inviting, the coach is sharing, the coach is observing, coach is talking about the intuition and so on and so forth. And very often we believe that, oh, by sharing something, it may be seen as judgmental. Yes, it would be, if it is judgmental. And therefore, first you have to take yourself into a state where you are looking at the client in that ultimate potential where the client wants to reach. And can you therefore move from that space into sharing what you wish for the ultimate good of the client, the progression of the client? What do you with intuition or coaching conversation? I don't understand what that question is, but yes, intuition is something that comes up for you, which is non-judgmental, and you are able to express it appropriately to the client with permission and with the complete acceptance that if the client turns around and says, no, that's rubbish, that's not what I meant, that's perfectly okay. Don't follow it up. So anything which is non-judgmental, which you are able to share, which deeply comes up for you, could be an intuition. If there's attachment to is automatically bias, yeah, is having no preferences, sure. The fourth state of awareness obviously has no preferences because you are an observer. If you are a pure observer, you have no biases. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi is the founder of what is called Transcendental Meditation. I'm not sure whether that book is still available. It is I don't know, written about 40 years ago. His was his original primer on Transcendental Meditation, which is an amazingly powerful book. You might be able to get it in Amazon. You might be able to get it in an old bookshop somewhere. Yeah, silence versus stillness being, yeah, absolutely right. I totally agree with you, Bala. Silence versus stillness, or loneliness versus aloneness, for example. I mean, these are some of those things which, yeah. Mahavakyas. Yes, the Mahavakyas can be helpful if you understand what the Mahavakyas are really. Basically, all that the Mahavakyas say again and again resoundingly that you are God, that you are the ultimate awareness, that you are in the fourth state. It doesn't help repeating the Mahavakyas like an owl, who kind of stuff, which initially when I was trying to practice Ramana Maharishi's principles, all that I kept asking myself was, who is this, or whatever. I sounded like an owl till I really related to what he was trying to say. So it certainly can be helpful if you really understand what the Mahavakyas. Mahavakyas, for those who are not familiar, are like the 10 commandments, not quite the 10 commandments. These are not commandments, but these are great expressions of truth. There are 5 great Mahavakyas, which are taken up from different, the 4 Vedas and the different Upanishads which are attached to it. Basically, all of them seem to be about that you are the ultimate, you are true awareness. Yoga Nidra, I'll talk about Yoga Nidra in a separate thing. If those of you who are interested, maybe not the next session, maybe the one after that, we can talk about the practice. I can take you through a meditative process, which is similar to Yoga Nidra. For those of you who are interested, want to look at it, please go to, there's a site called Swami J. I don't know whose site it is. And just type Yoga Nidra Swami J. It is probably one of the most informative kind of websites that I've seen, pretty authentic. Most of what it is said in that are good. Michael, there are so many things that I'm not able to third generation. Possibly, maybe he read the 4th level, or maybe he is possibly a genius who found out himself. I have no idea about this book, but if you can send me the link, I can look it up later. Can someone who practice and preach TM like Maharshi still be with me? Yes, possible. These are 2 separate things, Deepa. You are absolutely correct. But first, I would like to, when Deepak Chopra points a finger, he would find that 4 of his fingers are pointed at himself. So that's different as well. Swami J, it's not Swami G, it is Swami, the second part, Swami J, Yoga Nidra. Okay, so I'll stop here. We are pretty much on top of the hour. I know that I've been very amiss. I have not promoted any of you other than, Jackie was in the panel, none of you others. I'm terribly sorry about this. But what I would really like you to do, please, is if you could send me some feedback in terms of what is it that you would like to learn more. I do understand the Yoga Nidra part, we will certainly do it. But this has been a pretty intensive session today. And I would like you to sort of, sorry, that's a dog suddenly, she decided to become awake. Yeah, so let me know what is it that you would like to take up in the next session. Specifically, any area that you would like questions to be answered, you can come on the panel and we can engage in a discussion. I would like to have the next session totally as an interactive session rather than one in which I've spoken pretty much. Yeah, it's programmed to bark at I'm very well trained actually, Gopalji. Thank you. And Michael, I'll take a note of these 2 books that you have mentioned, and maybe perhaps next week you can come on the panel with some of the others, and we'll go into greater detail. Thanks a lot. This session is being recorded. I'll have them uploaded on the supervision webinar material. And thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed it as much. I don't enjoy anymore talking full time myself, so I would be a little bit not telling the truth if I said that I enjoyed it totally. It would have been far better if there had been much more interactive session, but I hope next time that would happen. Thanks a lot. Bye. Take care. All the best.